This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, Death at Sea, Old Case Files, and Personnel Records. I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. Welcome to episode 35 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality, crime-related fiction. I'd like to thank Gold Shield patron Deborah Dunbar from DeborahDunbar.com and Coffee Club patrons Joan Raymond, Guy Alton, Natasha Bajema, Natalie Borelli, Joe Trent, Siobhan Pope, Leah Cutter, Ryan Kinmill, Richard Phillips, Robin Lyons, Jean DeRoche, Craig Kingsman, Kate Wagner, Marco Carocari, Victoria Kazarian, Rebecca Jackson, Daniel Miller, and Natalie Maran. Your support keeps the lights on in the Bureau. Please support all of these amazing authors by visiting their author websites and reading their books. You can find links to their websites in the show notes at writersdetective.com/35. And I keep telling you, if you have your own author business, please consider joining Patreon. It is free for you, and it allows your readers to support you financially through monthly micropayments, just like these patrons are doing for me. So give your fans a chance to show their support by creating your own Patreon account right now. So to learn more, just visit writersdetective.com/Patreon, and that's Patreon. Can you believe it is already the end of March? Man, the year is flying by. I'm going to be sending out the March All Points Bulletin, the APB email on March 31st. Now, if you aren't on the APB mailing list yet, you're welcome to join right now. So if you aren't aware, the APB is my curated list of links to resources on the internet that I think you'll benefit from knowing about. And I'm not talking about like a bunch of affiliate links or books to buy or courses or anything like that. These are things like real procedural manuals or white papers that are going to help in your writing research, or police discussion forums that may give you some insight into what a potential character of yours might be thinking. So many of these links are actually ones that I find doing my, day job, actually working in law enforcement. And so I squirrel them away all month long. And then at the end of the month, I send them out to you guys if I think it's something that will tie into what you're trying to write about. So if you'd like to get those kind of things in your inbox on the last day of each month, you can go to writersdetective.com/mailing list to sign up. When you do sign up, be sure to check your inbox right away for a confirmation email. And once you confirm your sign up, you're going to receive the January 2019 and February 2019 APBs right away. That way you get to see exactly what you've signed up for. And if it isn't for you, you can unsubscribe by clicking at the bottom of the email. I promise if you unsubscribe, it won't hurt my feelings too badly. So again, the link is writersdetective.com/mailing list. And also today, I was one of the lucky, I think 850-ish people to secure a ticket to this year's 20 Books Vegas conference, which will be held in November. And I saw in the conference listing, in the description, that they're planning to have a legal police procedural panel as one of the events during the conference. So I am looking forward to checking that out. My favorite cops and writers sergeant, Patrick O'Donnell, will be there for sure. So I'm looking forward to catching up with him. And be sure to like Patrick's new Facebook page. You can find it at facebook.com/cops and writers. He's another great resource for you guys. So facebook.com/cops and writers for Sergeant Patrick O'Donnell's page. And I know he's got a book coming out soon. So once that's out, I'll be sure to have him on the podcast as well. So anyway, if you are attending 20 Books Vegas, let me know. We might put together some sort of meetup during the conference, and I'd love to get a chance to meet you in person, because this podcasting thing is pretty one-way kind of a communication form, kind of like writing. most of the time. So let's change that. I want to hang out in Vegas if you're going to the conference. So let me know what you think of the meetup idea and send me a question while you're at it. Just drop me a line by going to writersdetective.com/podcast. All right, now let's get on to this week's questions. So my friend Chris Niles at chrisnilesbooks.com submitted this week's first question. She writes, if a person dies at sea in international waters, what's supposed to happen? How much flexibility is there in making things more difficult or easier for my main characters? Does it matter if there's a body or if the body is gone, say, eaten by a shark? What a whopper of a question, Christine. Okay, so there are a lot of parts to this one, even though it was a pretty simple question. So bear with me with this. First and foremost, we are dealing with a huge issue of jurisdiction, obviously, especially when we're talking about international waters or the high seas, as you may also see it referred to. So the overarching law of the sea treaty comes from the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea. So we'll call it UNCLOS, UNCLOS. The U.S. participated in negotiating or in the negotiation conference of this treaty, which took place over several decades. And despite 162 countries and the European Union joining the convention, the U.S. has not ratified the treaty, despite bipartisan efforts across several decades to pass this ratification with the required 2/3 vote of the United States Senate. So despite our legislative ineptitude and political BS, the U.S. still at least recognizes the law of the sea as customary, even though we aren't legally bound to it. So we believe in it, we just can't get our politicians to actually agree to join it. All right, so let's ignore the imbeciles of Capitol Hill and move on to what this really means for murderers, murder victims, and cops around the world. The flag that your ship is registered under, meaning the nation that the ship is legally from, means that the ship falls within the jurisdiction of that nation. So Panama is a particular favorite of the maritime industry, as the labor relation laws are much more relaxed than other countries that have things like minimum wage standards or working condition laws. So in your scenario, Chris, if the ship is registered in the United States, the U.S. will have legal standing to claim jurisdiction over any crimes happening on that ship anywhere in the world, including international waters. And we'll come back to the ship stuff in a second. The other thing that relates to jurisdiction is Title 18, U.S. Code Section 1111, so 1111, is the statute for murder under federal law. And Section 1111, Parent A is, well, okay. When I say Parent A, when I say parent, just a little sidebar here, that is what you will hear attorneys often say when they are referencing a subsection of law where there is a letter encapsulated in parenthesis. So Section 1111 Parent A literally means Section 1111 open parenthesis, lowercase a, close parenthesis. So that's kind of the shorthand that you will hear attorneys and cops and judicial officials use when they're referencing sections of law. And then also to go off a little further on this nerdy symbology tangent, if you've ever seen the typographical symbol that looks like a capital S over the top of another capital S, kind of like you adjusted your typewriter half a line and wrote the S again directly on top of the first one. That's called a silcrow, SILCROW, or double S. And that is the symbol for the word section. So if I say Section 1111, that will be that double S silcrow symbol 1111 after it. So just if you see that in print, that's what that means, and then how you can describe it in dialogue, let's say. So anyway, enough about typography. Get back to the legal lesson. So section 1111, parent A, under Title 18 of the U.S. Code, defines murder as either first or second degree. Now, interestingly, section 1111, parent B, states, quote, within the special maritime and territorial jurisdiction of the United States, whoever is guilty of murder in the first degree shall be punished by death or imprisonment for life. Whoever is guilty of murder in the second degree shall be imprisoned for any term of years or for life. So what is this special maritime and territorial jurisdiction of the United States? Well, for that, we get to turn to yet another section of Title 18, and that's U.S. Code Section 7, Parent 1. I know, I'm sure it's killing you. But it gets us to the jurisdictional answers that we're looking for. So Parent 1, under that Section 7, says, our murder will fall under U.S. federal law if committed upon, quote, the high seas, or any other waters within the admiralty and maritime jurisdiction of the United States, and out of the jurisdiction of any particular state, and any vessel belonging in whole or in part to the United States, or any citizen thereof, or to any corporation created by or under the laws of the United States. So if there's any kind of ownership interest of this vessel, then the U.S. will have federal jurisdiction over any crimes. But what if the murder was on that Panamanian freighter instead of a Disney cruise liner? So we'll also find that jurisdictional answer to that further down in Section 7 in Parent 9, which says the jurisdiction extends, quote, with respect to offenses committed by or against a national of the United States, end quote. So just to recap all that legal mumbo jumbo, the United States is going to have jurisdiction if the murder happened on a U.S. registered ship or if the suspect or the victim are U.S. citizens. And I'm sure there would be a similar legal precedent for other countries as well. So I would imagine Australian authorities would have jurisdiction to investigate the murder of an Australian national on the high seas or international waters, whatever you want to call it, regardless of who owned the ship. So if you're outside of the U.S. and you would like to learn more about how your home country would handle this, I'd start by going back to that first thing we talked about, that UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And I will include a link in the show notes to that. So now that we know that the U.S. law enforcement can investigate this murder in international waters, assuming that it was on a U.S. ship or it involved a U.S. national either being a suspect or victim, the next question is, who's going to actually handle the investigation? Well, the short answer is the FBI. Now, realistically, it may start with the U.S. Coast Guard being the first ones to make contact with that ship. But ultimately, it will be an FBI special agent that has the overall investigation. And many of these cases are ones where the victim has been dumped into the ocean, which is probably what attracted the killer to this MO of being on the high seas in the first place. So the challenge becomes proving a murder without a body, and most likely without a crime scene. The FBI are not going to be out there on the ship, but they will most likely come aboard once the ship docks somewhere, or it could be the Coast Guard Investigative Service. But think about how that would hinder your case from a story standpoint. Now, you might appreciate this. I found a real-life case of a British expat killing his naturalized U.S. citizen wife while out on their own catamaran. So we're not talking a cruise ship or a freighter. It was just their own boat. But they were out off the coast of the Bahamas in 2017. And this guy ultimately pled guilty to manslaughter. But what I think you'll find most interesting about this is in reading the FBI agent's criminal complaint, or, well, more importantly, the affidavit the agent submits in seeking the criminal complaint. It will look like one big PDF, but when you're looking at it, the criminal complaint itself is page 1, and then everything after it is the attached affidavit of the agent where he explains all of this stuff. And I really urge you to read this because it is a perfect example of well, it's a great document, I should say, where you get to see how the FBI agent lays out his probable cause to believe that this suspect committed murder, and how the FBI agent's training and experience lead him to believe, under penalty of perjury, that this suspect committed the crime of murder, and how it convinces you. I want you to read this as if you're the judge and see how you're having this story laying out for you that you don't know anything about. And that will help you understand the goal or the why of your FBI agent character as they are working through this case. So the link to the criminal complaint and affidavit will be in the show notes at writersdetective.com/35. So to go back to Chris's original question, the delay in law enforcement getting involved, the issues associated with not having a body, or the potential for a crime scene cleanup, if there is one at all. I mean, pushing someone over the railing of a ship is about all you'd really need to do. So you could certainly, those circumstances could certainly give you the leeway to play with the timing of your story and alter those stakes as you need. It's not as if the police are going to be right there right after the crime was committed. And one of the other things that you might be thinking, but what if it's on a boat that isn't registered to a specific country? Let's say it's not registered at all. One of the things of that international treaty when it comes to the high seas, or maritime in general, is you would think, I'm not registered by a country, therefore nobody has jurisdiction. It's actually the opposite. It's that any nation that comes in contact with you, if you aren't registered, you're essentially not claiming the rights of any country. Pretty much anybody can board you for any kind of reason. I mean, so if you're trying to be slick with your jurisdiction when it comes to registering the boat, just know that you're actually going to take on more scrutiny if you don't declare a nation. I should also mention that the U.S. passed the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act in 2010. For Chris, I don't really know. She didn't state where, on what kind of ship that this story takes place. But if you're considering writing a story about something that happens on a cruise ship, this might be very helpful to you. The Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act in 2010 in the United States established security and safety training requirements that cover things for cruise ship companies like evidence preservation, reporting of criminal activities in international waters, crime detection and prevention, and so on. So I will also include a link to that law as well in the show notes. So this and maybe a little more research might give you insight into the capabilities or the training that cruise ship staff may receive for dealing with crimes like this. So that may really help move your story along and have other characters other than FBI agents and cops be involved. And then to wrap this up, I should also mention that the conviction rates for at-sea murders is dismally low. So I would assume that's due to a lack of evidence and the tendency to plead the crime down to manslaughter if there is any evidence, just because the burden of proving that a killing was premeditated, which is that difference between murder and manslaughter, is so hard to prove in these instances, especially when you're lacking evidence. So definitely be sure to check out that affidavit that I will have in the show notes, because it will really show you how, in that case, there was not a body, but they, take all of those facts and circumstances and things collectively to paint this broader picture that leads to probable cause to make that arrest. So thank you for the question, Chris. You can find her work again at chrisnilesbooks.com. New Coffee Club patron Daniel Miller sent in the next two questions. So Daniel writes, "Hi, Adam. First of all, kudos on a very professional and informative podcast. I'm working my way through the older posts and enjoying them immensely. Thank you." Thank you for saying so, Daniel. I appreciate it. I'm glad you're checking out the older ones. Some questions about paperwork. Number one, how are case files stored? Are the reports of evidence and interviews and the like all stored digitally, or are hard copies stored somewhere? Would a hard copy exist for a 10-year-old homicide cold case? Is there a chain of custody for such files as there is for evidence? Well, with modern day, the majority of our reports are done digitally. It is possible to print them out, and I think there is a tendency to want to still print out a murder book or a homicide book where you're putting everything into a binder just as kind of like a working copy of everything. So that way you have a central repository of the information. Whether they're still doing that or if they're doing like a digital murder book, I know that there are some major case software solutions for this. So that way we're not printing these things out. They're staying in the computer for tracking and kind of collating all of that kind of stuff together. However, for a 10-year-old cold case, it is very plausible that the homicide book or the murder book will still exist and be in the cold case archives or cold case office if the police agency you're writing about actually has one of those. All of those things are going to be stored digitally for us just because it's literally a matter of physical storage space. We have those Connex or C-Train like giant shipping containers. We've had those in the past filled with old reports. You know, they're just susceptible to being damaged, whether that's water or, you know, those silverfish insect things or whatever it is. I mean, you're better off in what we have seen in this movement from analog to digital is that we've had data entry clerks in our records bureaus literally sit there and scan them into like a laserfiche or a microfiche kind of PDF style repository. So that way we can, you know, anybody with access to the system with the right permissions can go in and see these historical documents without having to worry about the one existing piece of paper, you know, standing the test of time. Plus, once all those things are scanned into these systems that have redundant, you know, storage, then we can get rid of the physical document because it takes up so much space. I know a single piece of paper doesn't seem like it takes up so much space, but if you're looking at binders upon binders of reports, it can be quite shocking how much room it takes. Whether those reports have some sort of chain of custody, it's not a chain of custody in the sense that you are tracking the location of a physical item of evidence and who was responsible for it and where it was at all times. But and this is particularly true with the digital stuff, is you will have an audit log. So with the old like hard copy case files, there would be a cover sheet where the records clerk would write down anytime that report, somebody made a photocopy of that report, they would write down who it was that got a copy of it and what the reason was and how many pages it was. So when the attorney of the suspect came in and got a copy, you know, they would write down who it was, or if it was a paralegal for that attorney, what the date was, how many pages it was, and all that kind of stuff. Or a detective that was getting a copy for the homicide book, or a detective who came in 5 years later to get a copy because it was time to go to court and they needed a copy of the report for making their testimony. They're making their appearance in court. And it's important to note that the reason why a report doesn't have a chain of custody and why it's just an audit log is because these reports are really just a way of documenting what happened. But when we're talking about court and being able to prove a case, you're not entering a police report into evidence. The police report is there to refresh the memory or refresh the recollection of the detective or police officer that is testifying as to what they did or what happened or what they saw or what somebody else told them, which arguably could be hearsay. But when we're talking about two halves to a conversation, you may be witness to a statement. That's the reason why reports aren't exactly, you know, evidence. And they're also, they are important and we do track them. And that's with the audit log. Now with the digital audit log of the reports, not only do we see who made copies of it, now we can see who accessed it. With the old report, it wouldn't in a records bureau, I could go in and take a look at the report, read it, and not get a copy. And that would not necessarily get logged on the face page. But with the newer digital system, it will show up if somebody is reading or who has read the report. It's a way to just track who's doing what and why. As for those case files, again, they may or may not be still in existence. More than likely, if it's more than 10 years old, it probably has been scanned into some sort of digital repository of some sort. And then the interviews as well, there may be transcripts or there may just be recordings that have not been transcribed. The recordings themselves would be considered as evidence, so they will probably still be in the evidence locker, or if they were uploaded to the computer, they would still be saved digitally one way or another. But yeah, if you're writing about a cold case, the older the case, the more likely it is that they still have actual hard copies. And then Daniel's next question is, when a detective transfers to a PD in another city, would that detective's full personnel file and history be available to the captain of the new investigations department in hard copy or digital format? Thank you again. Well, you're welcome, Daniel. How do I put this? We still have to abide by all of the same labor laws as everyone else in the country. So not only would the personnel file not go with him, even if it did, the captain of the investigations department would not be the one to see it. It would be whoever was in charge of human resources. So there are some serious privacy things in place under labor law that are not necessarily specific to law enforcement as far as what can and can't be released to another employer. When we say transfer to a new police department, he's really leaving the employment of one agency and going and starting anew with a new agency. So no different than you leaving one company and going to another company in the same field that you work in. You really are starting over brand new. Now, whether they hire him as a detective at the new agency, how feasible that is, I don't know. We can leave that up to you and your creativity. There are certainly agencies that hire detectives, but normally you start at the patrol officer level and then would have to test your way into the detective position for that next agency because you don't have the seniority. You're still on probation and you're trying to cut in line for the other patrol officers that have been at that agency for a while trying to get into the detective bureau. So, but I'm sure you can create a plausible scenario that makes this a reality for your story. So that's not a big issue. But what would happen when he leaves the first agency and goes to the next one would be that the background investigator for this new department would contact the previous agency and would not be able to see that personnel file most likely. If there was anything in that personnel file that was a concern, which I'm guessing you might be alluding to here as far as a story idea. Now, what the background investigator from the new agency would be able to do is ask the first agency whether they would recommend him for the employment or have any reservations about his employment. And I don't know if there's much more than that they can do. I don't think that they can see like internal affairs reports or any of those kind of things. It's still going to be a human resources issue and not something that the boss of the investigations division or detective bureau is necessarily going to be allowed to know. Now, if it's a really small agency where the police chief is the captain of the investigations department and the head of the HR department, I guess that's a possibility. But typically speaking, your personnel issues stay with personnel and your investigative issues stay with investigations. And if something comes up, then it gets referred to internal affairs for investigation, and then HR or personnel will get notified as to what to include into that personnel file. Personnel files traditionally are pretty well protected from freedom of information requests. So outside personnel may have a very hard time getting access to that, even if it isn't part of an employment screening thing. So I would say that you have to do some pretty deep research yourself, Daniel, to find exemptions to this where this might be possible or plausible when we're talking about the story. If you are trying to create something in the history of this detective, you might be better off having it be a person that reveals this information in your story rather than the document or the file itself, for a variety of reasons. One is that it's much more believable, but then also it creates a scene that I think is more dynamic and pushes the story along rather than, saying that the captain read this report. I think from a storytelling perspective, you can actually tease out some better information and keep things moving, I guess, if you will. And then, of course, we always want to be thinking that what if my story, my intellectual property, actually gets turned into a movie or a TV show one day? That's something that the screenwriter is going to do with that, because it's really hard to show that somebody read something and knows this in their head versus showing it in an actual scene of two people talking, and we get some sort of reveal and we get some insight that there's this other character that knows this about our new detective transfer. So just some ideas. So yeah, thank you for the question, Daniel, and thanks again for being a supporter on Patreon. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Writers Detective Bureau podcast. 2 days left, I think, by the time that I release this podcast for the March 2019 APB. So if you'd like to join that email, again, the link for that is writersdetective.com/mailing list. Let me know if you're going to 20 Books Vegas or send me a question. Either way, you can reach out to me by going to writersdetective.com/podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great week and write well.